Hey everybody, let's talk about creating a motion blur in Photoshop, how we can use that to enhance our images. All right, so let's get fired up and look at an example. So what I've got for us here is an image that you might see in an advertisement where you've got a car racing down the road and you've got, here we've got the tires spinning, we've got the background blurred. Something that you might be able to capture in a camera with a particular shutter speed and so on, creating that motion blur in the background. But pretty obviously, this is an image enhancement. So what we can do is recreate something like this by combining two images and strategically using a motion blur. So that's what we're going to work on. So what we're going to start out with is we've got this open road picture that we've got, and we're going to add this car onto that open road and make it look like it's zooming down the road. So first things first, you do need to make sure that your pictures are in a reasonable, similar perspective. So here we've got kind of that background image. You can see the vanishing point off to the side, and the car is obviously in that same direction, same perspective. The samples I have here provided, they're not 100% perfect, not 100% in the same perspective, but we're going to be able to get away with it either way. So the first thing we need to do is basically take this picture and put it onto our road. And I've decided the simplest thing to do is just going to be copy and paste it. To remove it from its background, it's on a white background, which should make it pretty easy for us. And then we're going to use, strategically, we're going to use blurs and stuff to make it blend with the background. So I think I'm going to start out by just using quick selection and just doing a pass over the car to try to select it and get the car. Click around, make sure I get all the separate pieces, look closely, make sure I didn't leave anything out. Yeah, that's good. Just a little tail light, and I think looking around, oh, I missed a little on the front. So I'll just kind of cruise in here up near the front of the windscreen. All right. So I think that's pretty good. I think I've got the majority of the car. And I'm going to go ahead and copy it, and then I'm going to go ahead and paste it. Paste it into the road. Now, it's the wrong size, so I'm going to go ahead and scale it. So I'm going to go to the Edit menu, and I am going to transform this fella. Edit, transform, and scale. And then I'm going to drag it down and resize it so it fits on the road. I got to imagine that it's got to fit in its lane. So it's not going to be huge. Imagine the distance between the two wheels has to be, pretty narrow to make it look like it's fitting in the road there. And that's pretty good. That'll be pretty good for us. So when I get to the size I want, I'm going to hit the little check mark, or you could press return on your keyboard and get it in place. All right. Now this is where I said it's a little bit out of perspective. The wheels aren't turning quite in the right direction. That's okay, not a big deal. All right, now let's start working on the effect, because that's what really matters in this little demonstration. Let's try to figure out how to create that blur effect into the background. Now, because I have the car separate from the background, that's good. That means I'll be able to do some distortion. And then we're going to need to paint a shadow and do a few other things to make it look like it's actually sitting in the environment. So I'm going to select the background layer, and I'm going to go ahead and duplicate it. So I can duplicate by using the drop-down menu and duplicate, or I can drag the layer down to the new layer button and it'll make a copy. And I'm just going to call this background blur. All right, so now that's separate and it's up there on its own. Now let's play around with motion blur and see what starts to happen with our picture. So I'm going to go to the filter menu and I'm going to go to blur and I'm going to go to, sorry, I keep missing it. There we go. Motion blur. Now, as you can see, just a basic blur isn't quite enough. And we also want to turn this a little bit to get the angle of the blur to extend. And really you want to mess with the distance of the blur a little bit. So here you're going to be like tilting the dial a little bit, getting it to be the right direction. And actually, I'm going to type in -2. And I'm going to try to pick a spot here that feels right. If I go all the way to the extreme, you know, you lose all focus. But if I dial it in here, somewhere maybe in that range, let's try like 150. Let's just do that. I'll just type that in and click OK. Zoom out here a little bit. So you kind of see that motion line appearing into the background. But because that motion blur was applied permanently to the picture, that's why we made the copy, because you can't really adjust a blur after you apply it. So in this case, we're going to see if we can blend this with the background image and see if we get the enhancement the way we like it. So now I'm going to try doing a couple little blending modes and see what happens with the blur effect. You know, these color adjustments are not what I'm looking for. The darken, blur, really not happy with how those are looking. So I am going to leave that on normal, but what I'm going to do instead is maybe try opacity, see if that blend does anything for me. Still not quite right. So you can kind of see if I set the blur, if I set the opacity to somewhere in the 90s, that seems to look okay. At least makes the background look like it's a little bit in motion and you still see more detail from the tree. Maybe try 90%, see what happens. 90 seems a little bit better. So it looks to me like the best adjustment for that is going to be using a opacity instead of a blending mode. But I do like to check the blending mode sometimes to see if one of those will work. Okay. Now, the other thing I want to do is I want to further enhance the way the blur looks on the ground beneath the car. Because right now the opposing blur in the background over the tree and the sky looks pretty good, kind of horizontal, but we need a different angle on the street. We need it to flow a little bit more with the stripe on the street. So actually, I'm going to go back to the original background layer and make a new copy. Okay, and I'm going to make sure that I drag that above the car. And this one I'm going to call street blur, so I can separate the two. All right, now I'm going to see if I can just make a little image enhancement here and blur just the street area. Now, we haven't really gotten into layer masks right now, so I'm going to avoid doing this with a layer mask. But what I'm going to try to do is basically just isolate the street and blur that by itself, and then remove the rest of the image. So let's see if I can do a little quick selection of just the street. Yeah, actually that's pretty good. So I'm just using my quick selection tool and I'm just brushing over the street. And again, this isn't going to have to be perfect for this to work. But I've got that piece kind of isolated by itself. I'm going to zoom in here. And this time, again, I'm on the street blur now. I am going to go to Filter. The selection is still active, and I'm going to use Motion Blur again. But this time I'm going to turn the direction a little more extreme than last time. Yeah, and looks to me like an angle of about 15 or 16 is a little bit better. And maybe I'm going to stretch the blur even more. So see how this time I see actually that extreme is even better. These are those things where you kind of go back and forth a little bit, where you try to decide what looks best. For me, I think somewhere around, I don't know, that 150 again looks pretty good. Okay, so now I'm going to click OK. So I've got the street blurred, but I've got the whole background there, and I want to get rid of that. So what I'm going to do is actually flip or invert my selection and delete the background off of this layer. So I'm going to go Select, and I'm going to go Inverse. That's going to flip the selection. Then all I have to do is press Delete on my keyboard, and that blurred area disappears, and now I can just deselect, and the two images should blend together. Now there's a little distortion up here on the sides, where if I wanted to, I could come in with my eraser and kind of fix that a little bit. Maybe make sure I'm using a soft eraser and get some of those residual pieces gone. So I could go in and fix and correct some of those areas just by erasing little bits on that layer. But you can see how the two blend together now. The background has kind of a horizontal blur. The street now has more of an angular blur. So I'll move that up into frame a little better so you can kind of see that. So looking better than it was. Okay, so now it feels kind of like it's in motion. Now what I want to do is start painting the shadow on this car and give it kind of that shadow effect. So there's one other way I could do this, which might involve going back to the original, and I think I'm going to do this. So this picture so happens to be on a white background, and that's really helpful because you can take that picture and use it and multiply it over a background layer, and if you multiply it, the white disappears. And so you'll see how this effect is going to work. So I'm going to use this picture again, and I'm going to copy the entire thing. I'm going to go ahead and select the whole piece and copy it. And I'm going to bring it now into my photo again, and I'm going to paste it. Now, of course, it's the wrong size, so I'm going to have to scale it to fit it. So I'm going to go ahead and get that started by doing Transform and scale it. And before I finish scaling it, I'm going to go ahead and show you what happens when you use a multiply effect on the blending mode. So if I am on this white car layer and I select multiply, look at how the white disappears but the car remains and the shadow blends perfectly over the background. Actually, it looks kind of cool in the sky, a little abstract, but I'm going to move this down and kind of slide it into position. And it so happens that mine is on the layer beneath the original car. If yours came in above, it won't look quite right. So you want to make sure that the multiplied car is underneath the original car. And I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little more so I can scale this to the right size. And I'm going to go back to transform and finish scaling it. And here I just have to kind of eyeball it and line it up so that the shadow. So what I've done is I've used the original car shadow instead of having to paint a new shadow, just using that original car shadow in place. That's helpful. So now there we go. It's about the right size. It blends nicely over the ground and it fits in really well. That's good. Okay, last thing I want to do probably is a dead giveaway that this thing ain't moving is those rims on those tires. They're not they're not moving at all. So I need to do a radial blur on those to get them to spin. So here again, I'm going to go ahead and duplicate the top car layer. That's this car layer, and I'm going to do another blur on that one to make the wheels look like they're spinning. So I'm going to go ahead and duplicate the layer. That's good. And then I'm going to go ahead and use my marquee tool, the elliptical marquee, and I'm going to draw a little ellipse. Now here's a little trick. If you want to draw a marquee, usually you drag from the left corner and drag down, and that can be hard to center on an elliptical object. So actually what you want to do is hold the Alt key or the Option key on your Mac and click in the middle of where you want your selection to be and drag outward. So Option or Alt centers your selection based on where your mouse position is. Makes it a little bit easier. So here I have the front wheel selected, and I'm going to go up to Filter, Blur, and I'm going to do a radial blur. Okay, and then I'm going to have to click OK, I think, to see it. So let's see. I moved this up to about 60. See what happens. Not bad. If I don't like it, I can always hit undo and go back to the same menu and do radial blur and try again. Maybe let's bump it up to 75 or something, see what happens. That looks pretty good. So I'm going to use the elliptical tool here and draw another ellipse around the back wheel. I'm going to go back to that blur and I'm going to do radial blur. Leave it at 75, see what happens. Not bad. All right. So that's a very basic way to try to blur your background, separate your vehicle from its background, and using those blur effects, try to create that motion that you want to capture inside an image. All right, so hopefully that helps give you some ideas on how you might do the same thing. All right, see you later.